At 09:58 on March 3rd, 1943, the world outside the windshield wasn't ocean. It was a moving wall, gray water-white caps and wind-whipped spray that slapped the glass like someone throwing buckets at you for fun. The Bismarck Sea stretched flat and ugly under a low ceiling of cloud. No clean horizon line. Just haze mist, and the sense that you were flying inside a wet mouth. The B-25 was doing 200 miles an hour, but it felt faster down here. At 50 feet, the sea doesn't look like scenery. It looks like a decision. One bad bump, one lazy correction, and you don't crash, you get erased. Ahead through the smear of salt and fog, a Japanese destroyer took shape. 2,000 tons of steel and intent. The kind of ship built with one purpose, to kill aircraft that get too confident. You could almost feel its anti-aircraft crews waking up as you grew larger in their sights. Tiny figures on the deck. Movement. A scramble that said very clearly, "We see you." The manual had opinions about this. The manual always has opinions. The manual said a medium bomber belongs up high, 8,000 feet or more, dropping bombs like a gentleman, tossing coins into a fountain. The manual said stable level. The manual said bomb site. The manual said, in a language polite enough to be lethal, that coming at a warship at mast height was suicide. Down here, the manual might as well have been a bedtime story. The destroyer's 25mm guns began to swing. You could see the barrels tracking slow at first, then snapping into line. The distance collapsed 1,000 yards, 800 and 600. The ship got bigger until it stopped being a target and became a building rushing toward you. In the cockpit, there was no bomb sight. No delicate glass nose, no calm bombardier counting seconds. Just a simple iron ring sight and a thumb resting on a trigger switch that did not belong on a bomber. That switch was the only argument that mattered. Somewhere far behind you, in clean offices with polished desks, engineers had said it wouldn't work. They had said recoil would crack the nose, shatter the plexiglass, twist the frame, maybe stall the engines. They had used numbers, charts, and professional concern. Very convincing stuff right up until the moment someone starts shooting at you. Your thumb tightened. You held your line. The sea hammered past beneath you. The destroyer filled the windscreen, and then you squeezed. The nose didn't fire. It erupted. Multiple .50 caliber machine guns detonated at once, an angry, continuous thunder that turned the airframe into a vibrating instrument. The cockpit filled with the sharp stink of cordite and heat. The B-25 shuddered like it had been punched by a truck. And it didn't fall apart. Not yet. Down on the deck of that destroyer, something worse than fear began to spread confusion. Because what was coming at them wasn't a bomber following rules. It was a bomber that had decided the rules were optional. What made that moment over the Bismarck Sea so dangerous wasn't courage. It was contradiction. On paper, the United States had the most advanced air doctrine in the world. It was elegant, mathematical, reassuring. The theory said that wars could be won from altitude. Fly high enough, stay stable, and drop bombs so accurately they'd fall into a pickle barrel. That phrase wasn't a joke. It was repeated in briefings, films, and speeches until it became belief. And belief is a comfortable thing, especially when it's wrong. High-altitude bombing worked beautifully against factories, rail yards, cities that didn't move. The problem was that the Pacific wasn't full of factories. It was full of ships, long, narrow, fast ships that zigzagged across open water and refused to sit still like polite targets. A bomb dropped from 20,000 feet takes a long time to fall, nearly 40 seconds. In 40 seconds, a ship's captain could turn hard-change, speed-light a cigarette and watch the splash land harmlessly half a mile away. The ocean didn't care how precise your calculations were. The numbers were brutal. In the first year of the Pacific War, American high-altitude bombers hit moving ships less than 1% of the time. Less than 1. Millions of gallons of fuel burned. Thousands of flight hours logged, and mostly dead fish. Meanwhile, the Japanese ran what Allied pilots came to call the Tokyo Express. Fast convoys moving at night, protected by destroyers delivering troops fuel and artillery wherever Japan needed them. New Guinea, the Solomons, one island after another. It was logistics as a weapon, and it worked. From Washington, the doctrine still looked sound. Reports were optimistic, charts were tidy. From the cockpit, it looked ridiculous. Crews flew long missions, dropped carefully aimed bombs, and watched nothing happen. The war didn't pause out of respect for theory. This was the real problem. Not bravery, not technology, not even training. It was that the enemy refused to fight the war the way the manuals expected. So when someone suggested flying lower, dangerously low, the idea sounded insane. Not because it was reckless, but because it admitted something uncomfortable. The doctrine was failing. Breaking the rules isn't heroic when the rules work. It's unnecessary. But when the rules are quietly getting you killed, following them becomes the most dangerous choice of all. And over the Pacific, the rules were killing time, while the Tokyo Express kept running. Paul Irving Gunn was not supposed to be here. In the Pacific, most bomber pilots were barely old enough to shave. 21, 22 trained fast and faster. Gunn was 43. In aviation years, that wasn't experience. That was retirement age. The younger pilots called him Pappy, half as a joke, half because they didn't know what else to call a man who looked more like a mechanic than a fighter pilot. Gunn didn't fly like them. He didn't talk like them either. He had been flying since the 1920s, long before the war gave everything a uniform and a manual. He had flown naval aircraft and civilian airliners, hauling people and cargo over islands where maps were suggestions and engines failed without warning. He didn't trust theory. He trusted metal vibration sound. Machines told you when they were unhappy if you knew how to listen. That background mattered. Because Gunn didn't see airplanes as sacred designs. He saw them as tools. Tools you modified when they didn't do the job. When the Japanese invaded the Philippines, Gunn escaped in a damaged aircraft. His wife Polly and their 4 children did not. They were captured in Manila and sent to Santo Tomas. Gunn knew what that meant. Everyone did. Starvation, disease, guards who didn't need reasons. From that moment on, the war stopped being abstract. It wasn't about strategy or doctrine or winning someday. It was about time. Every extra week mattered. Every convoy that got through meant more guards, fed more prisoners, kept alive just long enough to suffer. Gunn did not talk about this. He didn't give speeches. He didn't rage in briefings. He showed up, did his job, and kept thinking. Quietly. Constantly. While other officers waited for orders or argued over procedures, Gunn looked at airplanes and asked a simpler question. Why aren't they killing ships? There was no patience left for paperwork. No interest in committees. Gunn had done the math in his head, and it was brutally simple. High-altitude bombing wasn't stopping the convoys. The convoys were feeding the prison camps. Therefore, something had to change, quickly. This wasn't heroism. It wasn't even anger in the dramatic sense. It was colder than that. Focused, controlled. Gunn wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong. He wasn't chasing innovation for its own sake. He was chasing an outcome. If the manuals said bombers shouldn't fly low, then the manuals were written by people whose families weren't starving behind barbed wire. Gunn didn't believe in breaking rules to be bold. He believed in breaking rules when the rules were useless. And in the Pacific, useless rules got people killed slowly. So when he looked at a B-25, he didn't see a bomber built for altitude. He saw an aircraft that could get close. And getting close, he knew was the only way this war was going to end fast enough. The idea didn't arrive in a dramatic briefing. It arrived quietly, the way bad news usually does, for people who believe in rules. Gunn walked into an office and said he wanted to put .50 caliber machine guns into the glass nose of a B-25. Not one, not two, several, fixed forward, no bombardier, no bomb sight, just guns. The room reacted the way rooms always do when someone violates physics with confidence. Silence first, then coughing, then smiles that weren't friendly. The engineers didn't need to raise their voices. They had math, recoil forces, center of gravity charts, stress diagrams. They explained patiently that the nose of a B-25 was a greenhouse, thin aluminum ribs holding plexiglass panels. It was designed to support a man sitting on a stool, not several hundred pounds of machine guns hammering forward at thousands of rounds per minute. Fire those guns, they said, and the recoil would shear rivets. The vibration would shatter the glass. Even if the nose somehow stayed attached, the added weight would pull the center of gravity so far forward the aircraft wouldn't rotate on takeoff. Best case, it plowed into the runway. Worst case, it took off and then nosedived straight into the ground. Someone used a term that stuck. Suicide box. It wasn't an insult, it was professional concern. The kind delivered with clean hands and tidy paperwork. Memos followed, long ones, carefully written explanations of why this idea violated basic laws of engineering. Why it would kill pilots before it ever reached a Japanese ship. Gunn read them, all of them. Then he threw them away. He didn't argue. He didn't try to win a debate. He didn't call anyone stupid. He simply didn't have the luxury of being convinced. The engineers were designing an airplane that would pass inspections. Gunn was trying to build an airplane that would end convoys. They were solving different problems. To the men with clipboards, the aircraft was a system that had to remain within tolerances. To Gunn, it was a weapon that wasn't doing its job. And weapons that fail don't get defended. They get modified. The laughter followed him out of the room, good-natured mostly. The old man had finally snapped. That was the story. A pilot too old, too angry, trying to turn a bomber into something it was never meant to be. But Gunn didn't need approval. He needed a hangar. He needed tools. And he needed people willing to get their hands dirty. If the manual said it couldn't be done, that only meant one thing to him. No one had tried hard enough yet. Innovation did not begin in a laboratory. It began in a hangar that smelled like oil rust and impatience. Gunn didn't ask for aviation-grade materials. He didn't request blueprints or approvals. He walked into scrap piles and started picking things up. Heavy springs, shock absorbers, steel plates that had already lived a hard life. Parts meant for trucks, industrial machines, anything built to take punishment without complaining. The younger mechanics watched him work and tried to be polite. This wasn't how airplanes were supposed to be treated. You didn't mix precision aircraft with junkyard hardware. That was how things broke. Or killed people. Someone joked that the old man was building a trap for himself. Another said the nose would tear off the first time he fired. The nickname stuck. Pappy's recoil toy. Gunn didn't correct them. His idea was brutally simple. The engineers had assumed the guns would be rigidly mounted. Bolt them straight to the frame, let the recoil slam into the aluminum, and of course it would fail. Gunn wasn't interested in rigid. He wanted movement. He decided to float the guns. He built what looked like a mechanical spider steel arms, brackets plates welded together without elegance or symmetry. The gun battery sat on a cradle that could slide backward when fired. Behind it, he packed springs and shock absorbers scavenged from wrecked vehicles. When the guns kicked, the whole assembly would recoil as one unit, the energy swallowed by steel and compression instead of ripping through rivets and glass. It was ugly, heavy, completely unauthorized. Holes were cut into the plexiglass for barrels. Ammunition chutes were routed through compartments never meant to carry rivers of brass. The aircraft gained weight in the worst possible place, right in the nose. From the outside, the B-25 began to look wrong, misshapen, aggressive, like it had been modified by someone who didn't care how it looked, only what it did. The mechanics kept shaking their heads. Aerodynamics didn't work like this. Center of gravity wasn't something you eyeballed with a welding torch. Every instinct they had said this would end badly. And they weren't wrong to think that. Gunn knew the risks better than anyone in the hangar. That was the point. This wasn't an accident or a shortcut. It was a conscious trade. Gunn was exchanging elegance for brutality, safety margins for lethality. He wasn't trying to build a perfect airplane. He was trying to build one that survived long enough to kill ships. Every added pound was a gamble. Every weld was a question mark. But unlike the manuals, Gunn was honest about the cost. If this failed, it would fail immediately. No slow disappointment. No months of reports explaining why nothing happened. By the time he was finished, the B-25 no longer looked like a bomber. It looked like a Frankenstein machine assembled under pressure by people who knew they were out of time. And that was exactly the point. The test flight happened early before opinions could gather momentum. Gunn climbed into the cockpit alone. No co-pilot, no crew. This wasn't bravery. It was accounting. If the airplane killed someone, it would only kill him. The mechanics stood back, arms crossed, watching something. They were fairly sure they were about to watch die. The B-25 felt wrong the moment the engines came alive. Heavy, nose heavy, like a truck loaded too far forward. When Gunn released the brakes, the aircraft rolled reluctantly, as if reconsidering its life choices. The runway began to disappear faster than Gunn liked. He pushed the throttles forward anyway. Acceleration was slow. The nose stayed glued to the ground. Every rule of flying said, this was the moment you abort. Gunn didn't. He waited until the very last seconds, then pulled back hard. The nose lifted, protesting. The wheels cleared the dirt by inches. The airplane staggered into the air alive but offended. That was problem one solved. Gunn climbed to a safe altitude over the water and leveled out. The cockpit was quiet in that uncomfortable way machines get before something bad happens. He reached for the arming switch, the same one the engineers had warned him about. The one that, according to the math, would turn the aircraft into debris. His thumb hovered. This wasn't like firing a gun on the ground. This was setting off a controlled explosion inside an aluminum tube and trusting scrap metal to behave. He squeezed. The airplane didn't lurch. It slowed. The recoil hit like a sudden headwind, a physical shove that bled speed instantly. It felt less like firing weapons and more like throwing out an anchor. The cockpit filled with a violent roar, the sound of multiple 50-caliber guns firing at once. The instruments blurred. The airframe vibrated so hard it felt like the plane was trying to shake itself apart. Gunn waited for the glass to shatter. It didn't. He waited for the nose to tear loose. It didn't. The recoil system did exactly what it was supposed to do. The guns slid backward into their cradle. The springs compressed. The shock absorbers swallowed the energy. The airplane stayed intact, flying straight, angry, but alive. Gunn eased off the trigger. The noise stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the sound had been. He checked the controls, still responsive. No warning signs, no sudden changes. The aircraft hadn't passed an inspection. It had passed something more important. Physics had shown up, done the math, and decided not to interfere. Gunn turned back toward the airfield and landed carefully. When the wheels touched down, the mechanics didn't cheer. They walked toward the plane slowly, like men approaching an animal they weren't sure was finished biting. They saw the soot. They smelled the cordite. They looked for cracks, loose rivets, shattered glass. There were none. The airplane had survived its first argument with reality, and reality for once had lost. What Gunn built was not a trick. It was a system. The guns alone couldn't win the fight. They could tear decks apart, kill gun crews, and start fires, but steel ships don't sink out of embarrassment. To finish the job, you still needed bombs, and dropping bombs from 50 feet was a good way to blow yourself out of the sky if you did it the old way. That's where skip bombing came in. The idea wasn't new. Sailors had been skipping stones across water since the beginning of time. Gunn just asked the obvious question everyone else avoided. What if a bomb behaved the same way? To make it work, everything had to be exact. Speed around 200 miles an hour. Altitude low enough to scare birds. Level flight, no climbing, no diving. The bomb hit the water at a shallow angle, skipped once, sometimes twice, then slammed into the side of the ship right at the waterline. Not on the deck, not beside it, into it. There was a problem. A 500-pound bomb does not politely wait for you to fly away. The blast radius reaches up hundreds of feet. Drop it too close and you kill yourself with your own success. The solution was delay fuses. 4 seconds. 5 if the pilot was fast. Just enough time to roar past the mast, shove the throttles to emergency power, and get clear before the explosion turned the ocean inside out. Teaching this was brutal. Pilots trained to fly straight and level at altitude had to unlearn everything. Every instinct told them to pull up. The ocean rushed past in their peripheral vision like a blur. The margin for error was measured in feet and heartbeats. Too high, the bomb sank. Too low, the splash caught the tail. Too slow, you died. Gunn flew with them. Sat in the co-pilot seat. Yelled over engine noise. Lower. Lower. If you weren't afraid, you were too high. Some pilots washed out. Some learned. The ones who learned changed. Then the guns came back into the equation. On a traditional bombing run, the aircraft is the target. On this run, it fought back. 2 miles out, the pilot opened fire. The nose guns swept the deck-shredded gun positions, smashed the bridge. The ship's anti-aircraft crews ducked or died. By the time the bomber was close enough to release the bomb, the ship wasn't aiming anymore. This changed everything. The pilots stopped feeling like cargo drivers. They weren't dropping something and hoping. They were suppressing, closing, and killing in sequence. A rhythm. Guns first, bomb second, escape third. Confidence replaced fear, not recklessness, but clarity. They knew exactly what they were doing and why it worked. This wasn't a desperate gamble anymore. It was a repeatable method. That's when it became dangerous. Not because it was wild, but because it was controlled. The B-25 wasn't just a bomber now. It was a hunter. And once the pilots understood the system, they stopped asking if it could work. They started asking how many times they could do it in one mission. When the weather finally lifted over the Bismarck Sea, the Japanese convoy believed it had won. 8 transports, heavy escorts, thousands of troops packed below deck. They moved in formation, confident, scanning the high sky for bombers that would never come. For years, that expectation had kept them alive. They were looking in the wrong direction. The first attacks didn't feel like a battle. They felt like a mistake. Aircraft appeared at wave height, too low, too fast, doing things bombers weren't supposed to do. The guns spoke first. Decks were swept clean. Bridges went silent. By the time bombs arrived, the ships were already blind. The results were immediate and undeniable. Transports split open at the waterline. Destroyers burned. Maneuvers didn't help. Zigzagging didn't help. Speed didn't help. The new system didn't care. By midday, the sea was no longer a route. It was a graveyard. For the Japanese command, the shock was total. This wasn't a loss explained away by weather or bad luck. This was a method they had no answer for. Within hours, reports moved up the chain. Low-level attacks. Extreme accuracy. Convoys annihilated. Reinforcement by sea became impossible. The Tokyo Express ended that week. Back, on the Allied side, disbelief came first, then silence, then imitation. What had been called a suicide box became a template. Factories took notes, drawings were copied, the glass noses disappeared, solid metal replaced them, guns moved forward. What had been built in a muddy hangar was standardized and shipped by the hundreds. Doctrine didn't adapt gracefully. It surrendered. Gun didn't celebrate. Victories didn't interest him. Outcomes did. And the outcome he cared about wasn't on a map. In Manila, behind barbed wire, time had been running out. When Allied forces finally broke through the gates of Santo Tomas, they found survivors barely holding on. Among them were Gunn's wife and children. Alive. That was the only statistic that mattered. After the war, historians would argue about tactics, credit commanders, and draw clean arrows across maps. Gunn ignored all of it. He went back to flying, back to fixing machines, back to living without manuals. His real legacy didn't end in 1945. It took shape in aircraft that came later. Planes built around guns instead of bombs. Aircraft designed to fly low, hit hard, and stay long. The logic lived on. The lesson wasn't about courage, or genius, or even technology. It was about speed. The side that adapts faster than its doctrine survives. The side that waits for permission does not. Gunn didn't win because he broke rules. He won because he recognized early that the rules were already broken, and while others debated theory, he built an answer. Out of scrap metal, out of urgency, out of time,